You can take the boys out of the city, but you can never plug a dam in Denmark with your thumb. Intrepid Radio, with a haphazardly focused Scotty Roberts and the rollicking adventurous Dr. John Ward, sticking their fingers in the hole in the dike of humanity.
This is Scotty Roberts. You are listening to the Intrepid Radio program with Dr. John Ward, live from the deck of his dahabeah in Gebel El Silsila, moored on the Nile River at the Speos of Horemheb, where the golden pink rays of the sun are just hitting its eastern face and illuminating the west bank of the Nile.
Oh, you make it sound as if I want to be here.
How's your orange juice this morning, John?
Oh, I wish. I have a very lukewarm, half-drunk bottle of water, a cold cup of coffee, and I'm surrounded by mosquitoes.
I thought you were going to say something like rum or bourbon. Hey, John, how's this one? I hope this doesn't rub it in too quickly, but how's the bacon this morning?
You're an evil man. You're an evil man.
But I make up for it.
Curse you.
I make up for it with guests like Barrie Schwortz. He is. It redeems me. Barrie, I would be very, very interested in having you share with people over the next few minutes the high points for you, the things that for you said, okay, here is my bullet point list of the things that make me believe there is something more to this shroud than meets the eye. And I was, as I mentioned on the break, I was very impressed a few years ago when I first talked with you, when you talked about the depth of microns that it took for paint to adhere to fiber. And yet all the arguments and the debunkers seem to be saying it's a painted image. But what is it about that doesn't ring true?
Well, everything. Look, a painted image, if you paint something onto a piece of woven cloth, the paint, the pigment, the binder that holds it all, the fluid that carries it, if you will, that will permeate into the cloth. And we have blood stains that are of a similar nature, and when we viewed the cloth with transmitted light passing through it, wherever there was a stain, whether it was a water stain from the fire when they put out the fire, whether it was scorches, burns, whether it was the blood stains, they were all more dense, darker, and held back the light, but the image was invisible because the image is only 2 microns thick on the top surface of the top fibrils. So that in itself is one thing that no artist could create. There's another thing about the image that, and I'm probably going to focus most on the image because that was the thing that hooked me.
Sure.
There is something encoded in the image that normal photographs or artworks never have. And I can say that to an absolute certainty. There is information encoded in the density or the lights and darks of the image itself that are directly proportionate to the distance between the cloth and the body when the image formed. Where the cloth and the body came in direct physical contact, top of the hands, tip of the nose, top of the knees, the image is most dense or darkest.
Sure.
As the distance increased up to about 4 centimeters, the image grows more faint gradually until it reaches extinction at about 4 centimeters, 3.7 to 4 centimeters. That means that topographical information has been encoded into the density of the image. In other words, it's like a topographical map. And we can extract that data, and it yields the natural relief of the human form. Put a normal photograph in there, doesn't do it. Any artwork doesn't do it. But you get the natural relief of the human form from the shroud, implying, and I think one could then draw this conclusion, John can correct me if he disagrees, the only way that this could have occurred and encode that kind of information is if the cloth and the body came into some kind of contact and some interaction occurred between the two of them.
Oh,
There's no other way that I can think of.
That astounds the hell out of me, and it's It's one of those things where I guess you could say I've always been a skeptical believer in certain types of phenomenon of belief systems and so on. I don't want to say it's easy for me to believe. It's easy for me to start accepting that there's something different out there. For me to put my faith in it, it's tough. I need to have some facts. It's like show me the money when it comes to faith.
I'm glad you said faith, because I wanted to address that.
Okay.
Look, the Shroud didn't come with a book of instructions. And the answer to faith isn't going to be on a piece of cloth. But it might well be in the eyes and the hearts of those who look upon it. So I always tell people that the Shroud is a personal thing to each one of us. Each one of us will get something from it or not. There's no guarantee that you will or you won't. But the point is, each person has to look at it, confront it, think about it, and in the end, decide for himself what it means. I don't think any one person should be dictating the meaning of the Shroud, as so many people do. I admit many people do that. I think that it's up to each person to decide for himself what it means. So I don't think that necessarily somebody's faith should rely on it. But on the other hand, skepticism isn't something modern. There was a guy named Thomas in the Gospels who was pretty skeptical, and he wasn't satisfied until he put his hand in the wound.
Right.
So I guess skeptics have been around for a long time.
Right. And then, of course, even that story itself is a story you have to believe by faith as something that actually happened if you're going to believe it.
I don't know if it actually happened or not. I'm just using that as a...
Right. And that's my point, is that we don't know for sure.
Well, here's the bottom line. Scotty, bottom line, science can never prove who that man is, ever. Modern science can never prove it. So we can't prove that's Jesus, because people say, what about DNA? Well, my answer is, do you have a complete set of Jesus's DNA? Because DNA is a comparative analysis. They find some at a crime scene, they find a bad guy, they match him up, there's your guilty guy. But if you don't have Jesus's DNA, how do you know? And then there's contamination. You realize we're shedding DNA all the time, all of us. My DNA is on the Shroud. I handled it.
Right.
So my DNA is on there. So how do you know whose DNA? So bottom line is, it's going to be impossible for science to prove who that man on that cloth is. So there always comes a point with the Shroud of Turin where it's up to anybody who's regarding it to make that choice for themselves. Simple as that.
Right. Well, I hope I didn't throw you too far off your bullet-pointed list that I was asking.
No, but I think I probably hit the biggest ones already, Scotty.
I think you have.
Look, there are probably 1,000 other points that I could name. And I have to tell you that even though there was one that brought me over the threshold, that question of the red blood, it was really an accumulation of just overwhelming evidence in every step of the way that ultimately led me to my conclusion. So it wasn't just one thing or two things.
Right.
It's all of the above, and it's a huge amount of evidence. I mean, just go to shroud.com and spend the next 2 months reading it, because it'll take that long.
It's an extensive website.
It is. And you'll see then that there is just an overwhelming amount of evidence. But before we run out of time, let's address the carbon dating, because...
Yes, I was going to ask you that specifically.
Yeah, let's address that, because that's something that most people have in their heads. That made immediate worldwide, news coverage. Shroud is a fake. And it wasn't until about a dozen years after the carbon dating that a couple of researchers proposed a theory that the sample that was used was not representative of the main body of the Shroud cloth. Until then, people were trying to attack radiocarbon dating, which, as John can attest, it's a reasonably tried-and-true method. There are some limitations of radiocarbon dating, but in general, it's an accepted, reliable method of dating most objects. Notice that I didn't say everything.
Yes.
Most organic-style objects. So, bottom line is this. 12 years later, a couple of researchers came up with the idea that the area that was selected for carbon dating didn't represent the main body of the Shroud cloth. This immediately drew criticism from all sides, pro-Shroud, anti-Shroud, everybody disagreed. But their evidence was powerful, and one of the guys from our team, Ray Rogers, a chemist, he was really angry with me because I reprinted their paper on our website, and he was really upset with me. he called them the lunatic fringe because neither was a scientist. And so he felt that they weren't qualified to have a paper on Shroud.com, and especially proclaiming such stuff. And he had in his safe some remnants from our 78 exam, including an area that was immediately adjacent to the carbon dating. So he yelled at me over the phone, and he said, give me 5 minutes, and I'll prove they're wrong. Took about an hour and a half, actually, and he called me back, and he was much more sedate and quiet. And he said, I can't even believe it, but I think they're right. He found cotton interwoven with linen, which is forbidden by the Torah, by the way, for burial shroud of somebody of high stature. He found dye that had been applied, like a reweaving had been done in there to repair it. You know, if you cut a piece off the shroud, it starts to unravel. It's the kind of weave that it is. It's called a herringbone or twill weave. And so if you cut a piece off, it starts to unravel. Somebody rewove it, wove a little cotton in with it, and then dyed it to match the color of the rewoven area so it would look like the rest of the shroud. But that was done probably 1500 somewhere, 1530s when the shroud was in France. And this was then put together into a scientific paper that was published in Thermochemica Acta, a journal that is like off the charts when it comes to credibility. And they made the guy go through a 5-month review, which is a very extensive review because of the subject matter. But we now then had, this was in 2005, the very first peer-reviewed science to challenge the peer-reviewed article that came out on the radiocarbon dating. Now, ironically, what most people don't know, and I don't want to get too far into this, the whole procedure of the radiocarbon dating of the shroud was very questionable. There was a protocol that they all agreed to and then changed at the last minute. There was 7 laboratories that were going to do the testing. It was dramatically reduced to 3 at the last minute. Then they stood over the shroud for an hour and a half arguing as to where to take a sample from before they went and cut a piece off. Then they cut a very small piece, cut it in half, took one half and cut it in thirds, gave it to the 3 labs. That's it. And from that one result, they got the shroud was a fake. Ironically, as soon as the peer-reviewed article came out claiming the shroud was a fake, Oxford Labs, one of the 3 laboratories that radiocarbon dated the cloth, received a £1 million anonymous contribution for debunking the shroud. And Michael Tite of the British Museum, the scientist who was overseeing the entire project with all 3 labs, left the British Museum and took a chair at Oxford with some of that money. So on top of the science that we now have several peer-reviewed articles showing that this sample site was not valid, we also have the questionable antics of at least one of the 3 labs and in their own article, it says they found cotton and ignored it, by the way. We didn't find cotton anywhere else on the shroud. So basically, we now have several peer-reviewed articles challenging the carbon dating and showing and proving that there was material interwoven that was more modern or newer cotton that would cause a skewing of the radiocarbon date.
Oh, man.
I don't know that I can say it any shorter than that.
Now, I had also heard that that part of the fabric that they had radiocarbon dated was from the edges of the fabric as well, where it had been handled and had DNA corruption for centuries.
Well, they weren't looking for DNA, so that wouldn't have been an issue in this case.
All right.
But they do use solvents for cleaning the samples. In all fairness to the radiocarbon labs, there are procedures for cleaning any material that's deposited on the surface of the fibers, like oils from hands or things of that nature, where they could eliminate that. But you can't eliminate something interwoven with the cloth. If there's newer material woven into the older material and you burn and date that whole piece, you're going to get a much younger date.
Yeah.
And so now, when you did the newer radiocarbon dating on this, how did you conduct that?
There has been only one radiocarbon dating of the shroud.
Oh, there has. Okay.
That's all. There has not been a follow-up. And there's some reasons why a follow-up would be ill-advised at this moment. When they took out the shroud to select the sample for carbon dating, they noticed inside the wooden reliquary that it was kept in at the time that there were some bug parts. And somebody got the bright idea of using a very potent chemical to fumigate the wooden reliquary box. And they used something called thymol, and John might be familiar with it, sort of mothballs on steroids, and a very powerful chemical. and it permeates into and gets absorbed into the fibers of the wooden lining of the box. And then you put the shroud in it for another 10 years, and they go to reach equalization. Some's going to come out of the wood of the box and permeate the shroud. And thymol is a modern carbon. It's a hydrocarbon. So it's going to also have an impact on the radiocarbon dating until the thymol issue becomes resolved. And there are a couple of physicists and chemists who've said that there are ways to deal with that so that it wouldn't skew the date. But until that's really resolved, I think that carbon dating would be ill-advised. They might get a younger date now than they got the last time, because the shroud sat in that reliquary for 10 years after they fumigated it, allowing modern carbon to permeate into the shroud. Yeah, I know it. You know, you hear this and you scratch your head and say, gee, it's too bad they didn't consult any scientists first before they stuck the thymol in there.
Well, Barry, I know we're running out of time, and I know Scotty wants to jump in and ask you a question, but I just want to ask you one quick question, and it's going to be a very quick answer. What went through your mind, or what was your emotional state of mind when you held it?
It's a very good question, John, and I will tell you this, that if you were to see the events that led up to that cloth being brought into the room to us, our equipment got tied up in customs for 5 days. We were there a week early to set up everything in advance, and because our equipment got tied up in customs, we lost 5 of the 7 days. So we were pressed. We had all these experiments that we had planned, a huge book full of them, and so I think most of us suspended our emotions. We just set that aside, because those 5 days were like torture, waiting for our equipment, knowing we were losing all this time. And so I think once the shroud was presented to us, we just got busy, and I can only speak for myself, that I didn't have much of an emotional thing, although I know that I recognized what we were doing was historic in nature, but I also knew that I didn't have any dramatic emotional response. I can't speak for a couple of the other guys. For example, there was an evangelical Christian on our team, 1 or 2 Catholic guys. They may have had much more of an emotional response to it than I did. My friend Don Lynn, who was Catholic, the gentleman from Jet Propulsion Labs, he told me that the thing that impressed him the most as he looked at the shroud was the peaceful expression on the man's face and the horrible, racked, tortured body that he was, on. So each person had his own perceptions, I think. So I'm afraid it's not the complete answer you were looking for, but my emotional response was minimal. I was, I didn't sleep much in that 120 hours. I think I was in the room 102 hours. Yeah. I didn't walk away very much, and because I was busy, I had to document everything, And so I think, but all of us knew that this was historic. That much I can say. We had that sense going into it that this would be a historic event. And, of course, since it's never occurred before and it hasn't occurred since, it truly is a once-in-a-lifetime event.
Well, Barry, I love John's question, because while we want to seek out the academic or the scholarly or the scientific answers to things, we are all still motivated by those gut feelings and those emotional things that stir us. Let me update his question. Now, I don't know if you've actually handled the shroud since that original time back in 78.
No, I haven't handled it, but I've seen it 3 times since.
Now, how does it strike you now, coming from this end of things?
Well, I've become intimate with the shroud, not in a biblical sense, but for 35 years, it's been kind of a focal point in my life, and especially in the last 4 or 5 years since we formed the nonprofit that now owns the website and owns all my photographs and all the stuff that we've accumulated. And so now I can devote myself full-time to doing this. I'm basically retired from my video production and photography business. And now I run this nonprofit. And so I really have seen this has become my legacy in a way.
Sure.
I have done a lot of things in my career, a lot of stuff in medicine, and I probably have more papers published in medical journals than I do in shroud-related stuff. But the bottom line is, it's wonderful to have something that is meaningful to a lot of people, not to everybody, but to a lot of people, and that you can provide them with accurate information about it. Seems to me to be a pretty good way to sail off into the sunset of my life.
Wow. And I would normally ask people at this point in a conversation here to tell us where's the best place they can find more about your work. And it seems to me that we've already done that. Shroud.com is probably the very best place.
Oh, and let me throw in this because it's reasonably new. It's only a year old. We have a Facebook page, but it's not under Shroud. It's under Stera Inc. So it's facebook.com/Stera Inc. STERA.INC. And that is, Stera Inc. is our nonprofit, Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association. So if you go to, so you can see our Facebook page. I try and put something up there every week. The website gets updated every few months. We have a mailing list people can join. They only need to put in an email address and no other personal information. And when the website's updated, they get an email, that kind of thing. So there's plenty there for people, and I try and make myself available as much as I can to answer questions. I'm getting 400 or 500 emails a day sometimes, so it's not always easy to answer everybody quickly, or for that matter, all the time. Maybe impossible to answer everybody, but I do my best to try and answer people's questions and make available the best materials that we can, and that's really what we do.
Oh, fantastic. Barrie, this is, we're pretty much out of time. We've got just a few minutes we're going to use to close the show out, but I sure appreciate your being here, answering questions I know you've probably answered 100 times, but...
that's part of my job.
There you go. There you go.
It has been. It's been a pleasure and an honor listening to you, Barrie. It really has.
My pleasure. Listen, nice meeting you, John. Listen, just the place you're at sounds spectacularly beautiful. Take some photographs, please.
Oh, we only a few.
Yeah. Remember, I'm a photographer. I don't go anywhere without a camera.
There's still conflict that rages over it, despite all the work you've done. And I think that's probably going to be the case for the rest of my life. But that I've just accepted that this is kind of an object that will always spur some controversy. Thank you so much for taking time out of your Sunday evening to talk with us.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's good to be talking to you again, Scotty. It's been a while.
Good to talk to you as well, too, Barrie. And it's been a little while, so it's nice to rekindle that friendship as well.
And nice to meet Dr. John Ward too. That's very cool.
Thank you very much, Barrie. It's been a pleasure.
All right, folks, that was Barrie Schwortz, and you can find all that he does at Shroud.com.
If this is to end in fire, then we shall all burn together. Watch the flames climb high.